Hey, what's up? Frank Lavinia here. I'm the moderator for this evening's talk on accessibility in technology. We are going to get started here in a few minutes. We're just letting folks have a few extra minutes to mingle and party like it's 2019 in an actual in-person event.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Keeson, the founder of Disruptive Technologists, and I'm excited to have you guys come here for the Tech Accessibility event. I'm going to introduce you to DiMeglio, the Accessibility Insights Product Manager, and our Disruptive MC, and one of our panelists, and on our Disruptive Board. Take it away, Sam.
Thank you. Hello, disruptors.
You're fine. I'm fine in the chair.
So Disruptive Technologists is a STEM nonprofit with a mission to educate, inspire, and empower a community of diverse disruptors, including women and people of all backgrounds, through a variety of platforms. We want to say a quick thanks to some of our sponsors and supporters over the years: Esther Dyson, Ramona Wright on my right here, Jeff Paul on Zeotag, the Microsoft Reactor, which is the space we're using today, the Cal Alum Association of UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley's Alumni Club of New York. Also, people who put business cards in a fishbowl. I don't know where the fishbowl is, but somewhere around here, there's a fishbowl. And the online lottery have a chance to win Empowering Entrepreneurial Books by Rebecca Costa and a 2-day Upflex International Office Space Passes for Ginger Wall and Disruptive Technologists t-shirts as well. And those prizes will be given out at the end. And now we have an hour to discuss tech accessibility, led by our moderator, Frank Levine, who is a data scientist, podcaster, and quantum developer working his way through the metaverse.
Sounds too smart for me.
A lot of people would disagree with me. Yeah, sure. So my name is Frank Lavinia. I used to work at Microsoft, and now I am at Red Hat. And one of the things that I think is important about accessibility is it's more than just what you think it is, right? It's not. There were some people talking before the thing, before this made the main event, and they were talking about, well, if we have a ramp, then we're good. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And I will share a quick story before I start. I once worked for a large technology company. Not going to say who they are, and they had a very honest conversation with their newly hired chief accessibility officer. And this was one of those, by making a chief accessibility officer, it really made clear the commitment. And this individual basically laid out a report card for all of the company's products, and it was miserable. That's why I'm keeping the name of the company secret. You can probably figure out who it is if you're clever.
Or yeah.
I'm not saying nothing. I say nothing. No, nothing. We were told to keep the meeting like secret. And this is like 6 years ago.
CAOs.
And you can probably do a correlation between where I work. But anyway, but this was an honest kind of look. Like, hey, this situation is bad, really bad. Now, I have seen this company over the past 6-7 years has turned the ship around, and accessibility is at the core of everything this company does now. So with that, and if you haven't figured out the secret company by now, I will start with Seth, who is your title is, you're a PM now on the accessibility team, is that correct?
Accessibility Insights, yeah. So that's Microsoft's product for testing accessibility across different applications.
Interesting.
The best one, might I? Just gonna say.
Oh, the best
shout out
one?
there.
I
It's
love
the
a
best one.
customer. I love a
Yes,
customer feedback.
Did you pay?
I didn't know, not yet.
Opinions are my own.
What's your approach about teaching accessibility? Because it's a very nuanced thing, whether it's visual impairment, whether it's mobility. Microsoft has done an outstanding job. I mean, even the Xbox controller was accessible, and even the packaging for it, right? I can't tell you how frustrating packaging can be. If you're not near the kitchen, you can't get a knife. And I probably shouldn't get it was like a big knife to cut open a box, but that's another story. So how do you have to teach about this? Like, what is your role? You have to do a lot of teaching, it sounds like.
So my role now is very much focused on accessibility insights as a product, and I do lots around like feature work and kind of what you would expect from a software engineering product team or something along those lines. But prior to my role on Accessibility Insights, I was actually a consultant for Microsoft, where I would go out and talk to customers about accessibility and more, what I thought was more important, inclusive design practices all up. I think a lot of times when people think about accessibility, they kind of go straight to compliance, especially as it's talked about at a lot of these big companies now. But one of my teammates a while back once said to me, like, oh, are you talking about big A accessibility or little a accessibility? And what he was talking about in that instance was big A accessibility, meaning compliance, like, are you following all of the, well, whatever the standards are? There's lots nowadays, like WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, Section 508 for the US, we have European standards, all those things. Or are you talking about accessibility as a means of access or a means of someone being able to use your product effectively? And as a consultant, especially talking to people that were new to, like, you know, accessibility has been floating around lots, especially in recent years, for big companies that are, you know, hiring chief accessibility officers, hiring inclusive design leads and things like that. I think what I would always go and start with at customers when I would go to them would be talking about the difference between those things. That compliance is helpful for checking things, especially against very specific use cases. But what we should be striving for when we're developing our technology is focused around inclusivity for all people, access for all people, not just for specific compliance regulations. And so that's my
Can I?
perspective. Yeah, please.
Are we able to add to that?
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
That I totally agree with you 150%. And where I've made the distinguishing termination, verbation, is I no longer talk about accessibility, because accessibility is about the big A or the little a, whatever the A is, checking a minimal compliance box. I talk about usability and functionality. That is something now through digital equity. We want to make our platforms equitable and usable to the broadest market of people possible. And now people with disabilities are at the intersectionality of all the other races, genders, orientations, and religions. Everybody can join this community of people, whether you're born into it, whether you have an accident, or whether you age into it. So aging is another one of those considerations that forced me to take a look at where's the disconnect in the conversations that we're having about getting people to understand how to build digital equity and maximize the usability and functionality of the technologies. And I think that kind of takes the stigma away and moves it away from compliance or the cost attributed to accessibility that has been with us since the 70s, when we had to rip out stairwells and build ramps and elevators.
So you said something interesting kind of while he was talking about that very few companies have a chief accessibility officer.
Correct.
Wow.
And you know, the some that do have them are AT&T, and I know Mark Balsano had started that, and there were chief accessibility officers over the past few years there. IBM had Frances West, who now is out on her own.
Yep.
You have Jenny Leigh Fleury at Microsoft. Go, Jenny.
She's listening.
Oh, she better be. Well, she better.
I've met
The
her.
recording.
Yeah, no, she's a fantastic personality, and Microsoft in general has really taken it. And what I've noticed that makes our conversation and what I call a calling for me easier is by creating compassionate empathy, not sympathy, not it's because it's the legal thing to do or it's the right thing to do. Again, it's about universal design and inclusion of people of ability, as well as people of race, gender, orientation across the board, a universal application of usability and functionality that allows people to execute in life. And not many corporations have a chief accessibility. New York State just got its first chief disability officer in one Kimberly Hill. We are the first state that has that. The only other one that came close, I believe, is Minnesota with their chief information and accessibility officer. I call him their chap.
So to my immediate left, I am remiss to not introduce the panelists. Next to me is Ramona, and you founded a company called WeUp. And how do you make tech more inclusive?
No, that is.
So much.
Ramona Wright. I am the co-founder and CEO of WeUp, and we are a platform that rewards people to stick to their goals and solve social problems via 30-day challenges. And one of the ways that we are making tech more accessible and listening to what some of the panelists have said about some of these big companies who've been around for generations, we as a tech startup, our platform is going to be launching at the end of this year, have been very intentional about inclusivity and accessibility from the start. And so one of the things that we did is we identified someone to join our UX UI team, a very dynamic woman who's based in Texas. And our team is one international. I think that's one of the first things that we decided to do, is be very intentional about having people from diverse backgrounds. But her partner is visually impaired. And so she's brought a tremendous perspective to our team, not only as someone who has a partner who has a visual impairment, but also as someone who supports people who use technology. Thinking about those people, right? Those groups of people who are supporting family members, loved ones, or working with colleagues who might have some sort of disability. So those are just some of the things that we're doing. And other things that we're doing is when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, ability is often the letter from an A that's often never really talked about or included. And so for us, one of the things that we've been very intentional about is working with recent grads from a program called General Assembly, which many people might be familiar with General Assembly. And a lot of things that people often talk about is once they finish these programs, they don't have a place to get experience. And so expanding this idea of tech accessibility from a physical disability perspective, we've really wanted to be inclusive from a pipeline perspective, right? Because we talk about accessibility, but we also don't talk about the creator's role in it from the beginning. And so we as tech founders have been really intentional about trying to ensure that we're creating diverse pipelines for often people who aren't in the creator seat.
Interesting, interesting. All right, and then to my immediate right is, he's a man of few words. It's Vaughn. But attached to Vaughn is his human, Albert. So why don't you just do a quick minute to introduce
Okay,
yourself?
so yeah, my name is Albert Rizzi, and this is Vaughn, the founder, Dawg. I'm one of those people who did not have any intentions or expectations of being a member of the disability community. I lost my eyesight unexpectedly due to a misdiagnosis 17 years ago. I immediately started a company called My Blind Spot, and it's more about the theoretical and philosophical blind spots in our lives rather than the physical blindness I live with. And we work to inspire accessibility for people of all abilities. We have worked with major companies like American Airlines, American Express. In the short time we've been doing this, we've made QuickBooks accessible and usable for the first time in its history. At least the desktop version, can't speak about the online version, still needs work. And I just basically took lemons and made lemonade with a side of Tito's, and here I am.
And our final panelist, who will talk, not naming names, is Cam. And what's you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cam Beaudoin. I am a speaker just on disability inclusion. And I come from an idea that, can we make this industry fun? Can we change it around? We talked about like regulatory things and compliance. And you know, this is a hard thing to do. And it is. I mean, I come from a developer background, and in tech, if you think about it at the very end, you're going to have a bad time. I'm just going to let you know. It's difficult to make something accessible at the end of your project. I see something.
Oh, at the end of the project. Okay. I'll keep
how about just for the release? How about when it's already out there in public? You're rewriting things. That's what you're doing.
Yep.
And I come from the belief that if we can just catch people just before they push the code, or just before they say, okay, here's the requirements for this. If I can catch someone at that moment and get them to think about a silly video on accessibility, or a fun or informative video on accessibility, or a story, something like that, through speaking to people with lived experiences, Albert and Sign Towards You, then maybe we can catch someone in the right time, and maybe they can just think about accessibility a few seconds before they, you know, go too far.
Close the
That
door.
Why not
project.
get it earlier?
Well,
Why not
that's
get it
much
when it's on-
earlier.
still on
Yeah.
the back of the napkin or the envelope? or on
Right,
the
right,
whiteboard,
right,
right?
Ramona was talking about doing it from the creative side, and when we were talking to American Express, one of their, I don't know whether it's an incubator, a think tank, wherever they start to design products, do we, oh.
Other side.
Otherwise,
Yep,
I'm
you got it, you got it. I want to make sure everyone in the audience.
No, please, people not gonna want to hear me after a while, but it's very important to Frank's point, and I think to Ramona's point, and to Ken's point. The sooner you start introducing the concept of building usability and functionality into that product, into that offering, it's less costly, less aggravating, less strenuous, less of a problem of retrofitting it after the fact. I don't know how many people in here are designers or developers, but have you had to retrofit something after the fact? How many of you forgot that I was blind? I can't see that. Clap. Nobody did it. See?
That's a good point. I
No,
hadn't thought
it's
of it.
okay. But it's fun what I do with kindergarten kids. They look like crazy. I can make noise. So I think if we build it into the process, sort of like baking a cake or baking cookies, and I've been to a presentation with one colleague in particular, where she created this whole concept about usable functional platforms being a baking experience.
Mhm.
You can't substitute baking soda for baking powder. You can't substitute flour for sugar or salt. So if you have all of those components and you start baking your inclusion product from the get-go, you can infuse usability and functionality into the DNA of your design and development team's efforts, as well as your corporate culture.
So there's one thing I want to point out. You're wearing a hat
Yeah.
that for most people would say hashtag ally. Why
Yeah.
don't you talk about that? Because when I first saw that acronym, I was like, what? Oh, that's clever. So why don't you explain for the folks what that means?
Well, hashtag A11Y for any developer. Who are the developers in the crowd right now? Is anyone just a developer?
Clap.
You know,
Yeah, no,
clap,
I would-
hands up,
I'm
maybe
curious.
online or something like that.
No,
I'm not sure.
understanding who the audience is.
Yeah, yeah. So in the world of development, the short form for accessibility is A11Y, because there's 11 characters between the A and the Y. And when you're coding, it's nice to have something shortened up. So, you know, just for your CSS or your JavaScript or something like that. There's another one, internationalization. Who wants to write that? So I18N is the short form for that. So that's what's on my hat, hashtag A11Y. A lot of people pronounce it as ally or ally. But if you have a screen reader, maybe Albert, you can attest, you're going to hear A11Y on there. So that's usually how.
Mine says
Or A11Y.
I'm like, what is A11Y? I have no.
Yeah. It's accessibility. It's what it is, yeah.
That's a whole new one on me.
Someone told me once, she's a brand manager, she says, Cam, you're not a developer anymore, would you take off the hat? I'm like, no, I will
Why
not take
not?
off the hat, I refuse, this is my hat, it's my brand, people, you know, I can go invisible, watch, just take the
Yeah,
hat
see,
off.
now it's
and
down.
then-
Where'd he go?
Yeah.
Where'd he go? I can't see him. What up?
I think one of the interesting thoughts was there's a lot of hype about Web3, right? But I don't want to go into that rabbit hole because it's a pretty deep rabbit hole. But you specifically, what are your thoughts on IoT and accessibility? Because for me, it seems like that could help, but if you think about it as the last thing, it's probably going to make things worse. So what are your thoughts on IoT in that space?
That's something that my brother Altera and I and our team talk about a lot, right? Visioning for the future. So even though we haven't launched yet, we're really starting to think about what are the ways that we can start thinking about IoT. I think one, I do believe it'll make things a lot easier for a lot of people, only if from a creator perspective, we have people who either have potential disabilities can be in the room speaking to the product development, or obviously really being able to, I think, from a user testing perspective, get people to participate. One of the things that we're doing, this isn't really related so much to accessibility, but one of the things that we started thinking about, our goal achievement platform, WeUp is one where imagine you could get 1 million people to do the same thing at the same time for 30 days straight, right? And take on any social challenge. It's a wonderful platform for companies that are wanting to support the UN's 2030 sustainability goals. So one of the things that we've done, we've had some wonderful support from Unilever. If you could get people in the Western world to take a 4-minute shower, how cool would that be? The average person takes an 8-minute shower. And if you have, let's say, a smart shower that times people, thinking of ways that you can use technology to solve social problems from an IoT perspective is something that we're working on. and working with municipalities, and I'm from California, and we're going into a drought again.
Okay.
So think about how IoT can solve social problems as well. So that's a little aside from obviously the ability conversation, but that's just something that we've been thinking about from an IoT perspective.
So when I think of IoT devices, most people more than the depth when I start talking about it, unless they're a fellow engineer. But probably the one I think most people are familiar with would be something like Amazon Alexa. As someone who is visually impaired, what are your thoughts on technology, voice-enabled technologies? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they different?
Well, it's interesting. We were speaking with Royal Caribbean when Alexa first came out. I think they're fantastic. I could see one of those being in every stateroom, and that way you can say, Alexa, tell me what's on the agenda for today. You don't, and again, not only is it IoT friendly, it also decreases our carbon footprint. We don't have to print out these things on a piece of paper. We don't have to worry about language barriers. You can have these all translated. I think it's a step towards AI, which is where IBM was moving away from accessibility tradition, from a traditional standpoint, and moving towards AI, because that's the next frontier. I happen to be very fond of it, and I'm still learning how to use that technology to its fullest potential, besides just timing my chicken when I bake it in the oven.
My kids have discovered that they can make an announcement and say something disparaging about their sibling,
yeah,
and it broadcasts throughout the entire house. So that certainly, I won't want to speak for the folks at Amazon who engineered it, but I don't think that was an
intention.
But do you see any kind of where people don't think about accessibility and in these voice-enabled applications? Because I know that they're trying to push the screen-enabled versions of Alexa.
But the voice prompted thing, and we just rebuilt our entire house, and I had told the contractor, who is my friend since I was 4, and the architect, who's my friend since 7th grade, dude, I want a smart home. And they totally dropped the ball and forgot about it. I could see myself walking in, as much as I don't use them, turn on the lights because somebody might be coming over, turn off the light so I know I'm not burning electricity, set the temperature, the thermostat, turn on the television. We're still trying to figure out how to get the Samsung TV to talk to the Alexa unit, but it's definitely, it's going to be like the Jetsons, Rosie, it's going to be the one you tell to go vacuum, or like Star Trek. I mean, if you take a look at Star Trek, everything that we had in that 1960s television program, the communicator is our flip phone. The only thing we have to do now is transport, and we'll be fine.
And replicators.
Oh, and I want the holodeck, dude.
I'm with you on that one. So it's been reported that 80% of digitized communications are not usable or accessible. Is it really that bad?
Yes. And it's unfortunate the federal government mandates these things. We have section 508, 504, and 503. And recently, the laws were adjusted to follow the WCAG, which is the Worldwide Consortium on Accessibility Governance. Don't quote me on that. And that is
confident. He had the
web content accessibility.
Web content. You see, I know. That's why I got the A11Y guy next to me.
You got it.
The problem with accessibility, in my opinion, and digital equity is that everybody expects there to be standards. And if you are a coder or a programmer or a developer, and you correct me if I'm wrong, there's more than one way to get to the solution.
Right.
So you really can't standardize this. What we can standardize are the outcomes. So we can say we need this result. How you get here is irrelevant, as long as it allows the technology, which is basically there are 4 types of technologies that people with disabilities use, primarily, with a 5th lagging behind. Screen readers, magnifiers. A screen reader takes the text on a screen and interprets it into an audio output, like an audio book. Then you've got magnifiers, which are self-explanatory. Speech to text technologies like Dragon Naturally Speaking, iOS and Android platforms. And then the 5th is Braille display. Only 10% of the blind population, which right now in this country is about 25 million severely visually impaired people, only 10% of those people read Braille because the teachers and educators in our schools don't read Braille, so they don't teach Braille. So we're raising functional illiterates, which I don't think technology is going to salvage that, but at least they're going to have access to information and opportunities to work.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm surprised that it's that bad, because you would think that, if it's in text, you think it would like SMS being kind of like I'm surprised it's that bad.
Now PDFs, there was a move a little while ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, and maybe I'm wrong, but I remember hearing this, how people were going to take PDFs off of their website because nobody knew how to make them accessible. And that's a simple fix.
Wow.
There's a lot of issues out there, and amongst even in addition to the 80% inaccessible platforms on a global perspective, and that takes into consideration any sort of digitized communications information, electronic communication, software programs, computers, all these things have little glitches in them. And I think that's where I think Ramona can make a big difference with Altera and everything, by having a socially conscious move to make sure your technologies work for people of all abilities, because I don't know how many of you out there are baby boomers. If you're not, we're all aging into the community of people with disabilities at an alarming rate. People who are baby boomers have amassed the most wealth in human history ever. And if we don't, whatever your products are that you're selling, or whatever your services are you're providing, if you don't make them usable and functional for people who need assistive devices to digest your information, you're going to lose loyal customers who are aging out of your group.
So this isn't just for the Microsofts or the AT&Ts of the world. This is big for the corner pizza shop,
Yeah.
corner coffee shop.
And they're the ones that are being sued, unfortunately, because there is, again, no quote unquote standard. And most people, and I sort of deviated from the conversation I'd like to see Ramona and Voltaire pick up, being socially conscious about opening up your digital platforms to people of all abilities, because there's a 70 to 75% unemployment rate amongst the disability community. There's 1.4 billion people in the world with a disability, 2.3 billion friends and family, $8 trillion of discretionary spending power. We have 62 million people in this country who are people with disabilities, where there is 4.9 trillion of discretionary spending power in North America, and $300 million of disposable income. They're market-based. We can't do this anymore because it's the warm, fuzzy thing to do for the poor disabled person. We have money, we have means, we are influencers, we are movers, we are shakers. If you take a look at how many people with disabilities over the period of life in general that we've all been on this earth, people with disabilities have helped move us forward and impact human condition. So Richard Branson is severely dyslexic. He was made fun of as a child. He was made fun of as an adult. And the man got us to space. You have Elon Musk. He's got some sort of spectrum on autism. I think now we've got to stop looking at people because they're different and embrace the similarities. 1 in 3 of us or 1 in 4 of us know somebody with a disability. Do you want the person that you love who happens to have a disability to be barred from doing anything on the computer?
It seems
No.
no.
That was
Yeah.
rhetorical.
Yeah, okay.
So I'll get to you, Seth, in a minute, but I think that as a founder, did you make a conscious decision to include accessibility right away, or did you just kind of stumble upon it? Was it kind of like what was the inception of that thought? Because if we can kind of bottle that, we can help other founders kind of think about that.
Absolutely. Before I answer that, I just wanted to say in regards to Albert's point about autism. One, I believe in 44 children are autistic.
Yep.
And so if we're thinking about an aging out population, are we thinking about the next generation that's coming up on how, think about it, they've been quote unquote connected since birth more than any other generation.
Yep.
But are we thinking about how to support that generation that's coming up that will have a tremendous number of people who have potentially some sort of impairment? So that's just one thing I wanted to add to that. I can't say, I will say that yes, we were intentional about it, but we were blessed, I think just by, maybe one would say by, divine intervention. When we launched our fellowship program, this is our second year, our second cohort, and the woman who I mentioned who joined our UX UI team brought a lot of things to our attention that we just would have never known, right? So I think it's one thing for founders or companies to say, hey, we want to be more inclusive, we want to think about tech accessibility or tech inclusivity, but if you don't have people you are trying to connect with who have those particular maybe challenges, how can you be informed? Same for diversity issues in regards to women and people of color.
Yep.
And so we sort of thought we knew, but we had no idea until we had someone actually from that community speak to us.
I think you did something even more important, you listened.
Yes.
And then second only to the fact you actually captured. Welcome. So you have experience in academia as well. How did this shape your views coming from an academic background and then into the corporate world? And now you're working at one of the world's largest software companies. How does that shape your views?
Yeah, so I have, +1 on pretty much everything that was said.
I'm sorry, I'm
Oh,
blinded. Are the speakers turned on?
Yeah, I think you just have to talk close.
Because the sound for the Zoom readers, the chat saying that some can hear some of you better than the others. So you might want to talk louder.
Close to the mouth.
Talk louder. Got it. So definitely +1 on everything that the rest of the panel have been saying. I think for a lot of people, and I see it a lot in kind of all the work that I do in community or even at work, a lot of people think like, I like to assume, good intention at the very least. And I think a lot of people aren't intentionally, to Ramona's point, intentionally excluding anybody. A lot of people just don't know what they don't know. And because of that, there's lots of room for improvement. What I found through a lot of my work is that a lot of people. Oh, I lost my train of thought.
Since you lost your train.
Go ahead, tell me.
Someone asked why we didn't use the closed captioning, the captioning function of Zoom. And you said what you don't know is what you don't know. When I was setting up this hybrid event, I didn't know there was a closed captions functioning on Zoom. Now I'm going to look into it and set it up. No one's ever asked me that.
That's a great point. And that's an awesome segue. I'll give you a minute to get your train back on the tracks. We were talking about this kind of in the pre main event, but we were talking about how, if you put something into PowerPoint, right, it automatically will add the alt text to it. I've noticed LinkedIn does this, a number of websites do it, is obviously using AI. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know I have a podcast, actually 2 podcasts, and I use the Microsoft transcription service actually. And it's not perfect, but what are your thoughts on either anyone who wants to answer this actually? What are your thoughts on having AI kind of do it for you? Is that the cheat button, or is something better than nothing?
So it's a bit of both. To be really honest, it's a bit of both. Even if you were to enable Zoom captions here, there are ways of doing it better. Right?
Yeah.
If you have Zoom captions enabled right now, what you're going to get is an AI taking in my voice, interpreting that, and I may say some kind of confusing words, or I may throw out the word like WCAG, and on Zoom captions right now, it probably wouldn't capture that very well. WCAG, once again, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So it's not perfect. You're going to need a human captioner in there to be able to really interpret this. Or if you had an accent, Zoom captions are going to be next to useless.
Or a speech impediment.
Or a speech impediment as well. If you're deaf and you're speaking up on stage, Zoom caption. I have a friend, her name is Meryl Evans, and she's deaf, and she, you should see, she calls them craptions because they're not that good. But is it better than nothing? Have we started our march towards a more inclusive society, and towards a more inclusive workplace, and attempt at that? See, going back to what we were talking about before, when was the first time you met someone who admitted to having a disability? Admitting that you have a disability, you're putting yourself out there and being vulnerable. Sometimes you don't want to admit that. So all of a sudden, we don't have the language to be able to speak. I mean, my parents never spoke about people with disabilities. The educators in my life never did either. HR departments are hesitant to even use certain words. They don't know how to say certain words. Maybe they'll say this blind guy over here, when truly we should be talking about putting the person before the disability. So sometimes we don't have the words, and that creates oh, this is weird. I don't know how to talk about the situation.
Like, the parents will say, don't stare.
Don't stare.
Don't stare. Don't ask questions.
Let's see. Now, there are so many things I want to unpack here. Going back to your, Frank's position on, I don't want to tell you who it was. If we don't tell people who the companies are, they're never going to realize that IBM or AT&T took that step. I work with lawyers who say, we don't want anybody knowing we're working with you. Well, it's better that you tell people you're working with professionals in the industry to correct your problem. So that way the disability community knows you're on the right path. And two, anybody who's doing the drive-by lawsuits won't be able to achieve that.
That's a great point. I think about that because like the meeting I was at this unnamed company, which y'all are clever, you'll figure it out. And
No.
you know, the chief accessibility officer basically said, we don't want this getting out because our evaluation is bad. But it takes a lot of courage to be, and I can understand the reasons for that, for not, when things were bad.
Old school.
Right, but I mean, it was kind of like, but they did something about it, just what you did, you know, I mean, you realize, oh, yeah, we have this problem.
Well, to Ken's point too, about I grew up with people who had disabilities in my life, but they didn't get labeled as a disabled person, and you should never do that because you can only disable a bomb, a car, or a computer. By definition, you can't disable a person unless you're killing them. There are people with disabilities, unfortunately. That's the terminology or whatever else you want to go. First person, putting the person first.
First person.
They were just Ellen, my cousin John, my cousin Christopher, my aunt Flora, my uncle Sonny. It wasn't until I was walking, you mentioned something that is a lived experience that I had. I was walking down 11th Street, East Village, with a beautiful chocolate covered raspberry cake. And I heard this young girl, maybe 12, 13, say, "Mommy, that man's blind." And I'm like, I'm not deaf, but I heard you say that. How did you know? And right away, the mother starts saying, "Oh, you should have never, I am so sorry. You should never talk like that to people." I'm like, hold on a second. My teachable moment wasn't for that child. She saw me. At what age do we, as adults, start telling children not to talk about the fat person or the black person or the Asian person or the guy with the dog? We need to be seen. Nothing about us without us. And I also like to say, hashtag don't diss my ability. I think the more we talk about this, and this is something that Ken said, and Ramona was saying before, and Zep, the more we talk about these things and actually have people with lived experiences or have people with 1 degree of separation from somebody who we're working to help and improve access to everything in life, the easier it will become for you to design and understand and create in an empathetic way, usable product and content.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, Albert. I think one of the things that we're not talking about, you have all these letters and acronyms, is an S word, and that's shame. And one of the things that we've learned a lot from our work with a company called Culture Creative, they're one of the nation's leading diversity inclusion consulting firms. We brought in specialists. And actually the founder is here supporting us, Mr. Julian Newman in the back. But we wanted to bring in people who actually work in this space. And I think one of the things that he's often encouraged us to go through is the shame and sometimes embarrassment of not knowing, of calling things wrong. And we're not going to get things right. But to your point, Albert, if we don't call things out by name, and if we don't go through those uncomfortable conversations with people who can guide us, we're not going to create the solutions that are going to be needed.
Yeah, I was going to say that parent in that situation, almost there was like an implied taboo.
Correct. Absolutely.
Well, and
To shame, basically. It's another word.
Yeah.
No, and to that point, there were children that I was walking by, and I before I got the dog, I was using my cane, my IT cane, and I hear this kid, 4 years old, "Hey, mister, watch that stick, you're gonna hit me." And the father said, "I'm so sorry." I said, "No problem." I taught kindergarten, teachable moment. I explained to the child what it was. He now knows what to look for. And another kid, it's elastic. I threw it out there like a magic stick. And it's just being able to have these naive, innocent, childlike conversations, which we all want to ask the person, how did you end up in that wheelchair? Just have, like, I remember, was it CBS who did that whole inclusion campaign, and Gail King said, you know, hey, how do you start a conversation with a person with a disability? I don't know. How about, hello, hey, my name is Gail. It's as simple as that.
Hey, can I add on to that one? That's great. This reminds me of the first time I have a friend who's blind. And the first time I met him was, actually, I used to work at IBM as well. And I don't know if you've ever had an interaction with IBM. Sorry if anyone from IBM's in the call. So sorry.
For the record, I work at Red Hat, which is a wholly owned subsidiary.
Not
right,
IBM.
okay.
Which
Yeah,
is probably why you looked at
These
me.
opinions are,
But-
no,
but, yeah.
I had a great time.
I know my boss is watching.
But it's full of A-type personalities, right? Like,
Yeah.
we got lots of, we got lots
I'm
of.
gonna just.
Did you know Drew Lahart? No. Okay.
And I saw my boss walk up to my friend and stick out his hand right away and say, "Hi, this is John, nice to meet you." And he's blind. He doesn't know there's a hand stuck out. Albert, I'm not sure if this happens to you. Maybe it does.
It does. Go ahead.
And I looked at him and it was this kind of, he stared at my friend and they were doing this kind of thing where, you know, who's gonna flinch first? My hand is out and I'm ready to shake your hand and you're not giving me my hand back. And he was, you know, they're giving themselves the eye, like, I'm gonna shake your hand and nothing's coming back. And I'm like, I'm not gonna put myself in that embarrassing situation. I'm totally shit. So I ran back to YouTube and I talked about how to shake a blind person's hand. I put that in YouTube. And all you have to do is announce.
I have my hands up in front of you.
Exactly, right? Like, I'm
No, just
I'm
now.
Ken. Can I shake your hand?
But see, this is the thing. We don't know how to speak. We don't know how to speak to one another. Now, what I've done is I naturally shake hands. So my hand is always out there, whether they're blind or not. And if it's a blind person, I say my hand is out. And then you see us like trying to slap each other and find it. But audio, I'm like a dolphin or a bat now. So unless you go, there's your chair. As opposed to, okay, the chair's next to you. Next to me, on my left, my right, behind me. So definite communication. But if you don't like present blind, I remember Lauren was looking for me at the restaurant. I walked in and she was, no, he doesn't look blind, but he's got a dog. Oh, but no, that can't be him. So it's a matter of our perception too. What do we think a person with that disability should look like? Sometimes isn't always what's in our head.
And I want to add to that, because when we met earlier, you put your hand out right away.
Yeah.
And in the post-COVID world, you're like, shake it in.
I could do this next time.
Well, no, I appreciate that, because you made something that was, you know, COVID
A bit
related.
awkward.
Right, but you know, you did that. I just want to appreciate that.
See, but that goes education on both sides.
Right,
Because
right,
people of
right.
ability need to speak honestly and open about how they want to be dealt with, treated. I don't know,
Right.
but I'm glad you noticed that. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I want to go back to Seth. It looks like you
Yeah.
caught your training.
I did, but I was gonna, there's so many good talking points. My talking points
It's
are
going to be only an hour.
obsolete at this point. I think to Albert and Ramona's point, again, it talks about this invisible disability that a lot of times people don't know about. That I think, I don't know if the percentages are exact, but I think only 25% of disabilities are visible disabilities, ones that you could actually see, maybe like on first sight.
I never thought of that.
Maybe. I think it's 25%, and the other 75% are a bunch of other disabilities that,
Variations on the thing.
yeah, like affect people's way of living in various different ways that, again, if you don't know about them, you're not gonna react or action against them. And my original train of thought that I was trying to say earlier was, I found that through a lot of my work, a lot of people end up thinking accessibility is someone else's problem or
Yeah.
someone else's job to deal with. Like, oh, I don't need to be thinking about accessibility as a developer because legal is gonna be thinking about it. That's an internal term.
CELA, corporate, external and legal affairs.
Yeah.
Yes, they used to work on it.
So I think something that I work with a lot just across, I'm part of like different employee resource groups at Microsoft and different like just community groups. A lot of people are always asking like, oh, what resources do we have? Or, oh, who's the person that I talk to about making my product accessible? I'm like, you talk about it. Like, you should be doing it.
Be the change.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just don't even realize that like it's a bunch of what Ramona was saying. It's from the inception of the idea, from the creator's idea that like when your manager is telling you, oh, you have to do this project, think about, oh, how are people going to be using my product? What people are going to be using my product? Am I thinking about all the different types of people that are going to be using my product? How can I make sure the experience is positive for all of them? It doesn't have to be the exact same experience for everyone, but everyone should be able to experience it in an effective way. And I think that's why a lot of my conversations around accessibility, I try to steer on inclusive design or just like usability in general. I remember when I was doing my consulting, I would always start my like inclusive design presentations with this graphic that had like user experience at the highest level or the broadest level. And then inside of that, I had, a few different things like inclusive design, whatever, usability, and at the center was always access. And I think with how much accessibility is thrown around throughout industry now, people forget, like, the reason why we say accessibility is because the core of the word is access. And whatever access means to an individual, whether they have both hands, they have one hand, or their hand is temporarily filled with, I don't know, groceries, it's all a matter of access. It doesn't matter specifically what that person's ability is. It matters how can they access whatever I'm trying to give to them. And so I always start conversations like that. And then it helps kind of bridge that gap of like, most people will have at least someone in their life, if it's not themselves, someone in their life that has a disability, regardless of what it is. But if you really can't think of someone with a type of disability, it allows you to think like, okay, well, I have both my hands, but maybe one day I was at coming home from the grocery store and it was hard for me to open the door because my hands were full with a bag, or it was hard for me to answer a text because my hands were full. That kind of like allows them to have some form of empathy, which I think Ramona, everyone's talking about.
And I think that for me personally, here's a personal experience. When I had knee surgery and I was on one of those little one scooter things, I had to fight my kids for that, by the way. But anyway, I did not realize that now when I saw the cut curbs, is that what they're called?
Curb cuts.
Curb cuts. I know where there are not cut curbs. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like I appreciated that. Now it's been 10 years since I had knee surgery. I don't have any problems anymore. But like, it's one of those things where it's not. It could be a temporary thing. Whether your hands filled with groceries, you had knee surgery, separated your shoulder, that sort of thing.
I did a blog about that. I call it situational disabilities.
Yeah.
You have a situation where you are temporarily disabled from doing anything, whether it's because you are recovering from an accident or an operation, or like your hands are full. Yeah, I'm disabled from opening my car door right now. But if we take a look at those situational disabilities, again, I think the key factor here is creating a sense of empathy, not sympathy. Understanding it impacts all of us, not just one of us. And there is a market out there that does warrant considering all of the different manners and approaches that you can take to make sure your product is usable. If for no other reason, our economy is suffering right now. We have people who are on public assistance programs, welfare programs, disability insurance programs, ailing financial systems that they don't need to be on. I myself was forced onto it. I could not go back and teach again because of perception. I was told I could not run a school again because how are you going to be able to use the computer? There are a lot of misnomers and a lot of things we generalize about people with disabilities. And I always use the story of Forrest Gump. Have we seen that movie? Okay. Forrest Gump overcame mental adversity, physical adversity, socioeconomic adversity, and because he lived by the mantra and his mother lived by the mantra of my blind spot, access to the right tools promotes ability and restores infinite possibilities in our lives. He was able to excel beyond anybody's expectations. If we look at the 62 million people in this world and we conservatively say 31 million of those people need daily care, the other 31 million people have high school diplomas, master's degrees, PhDs, and ain't none of them able to go in because 80% of platforms are not accessible and perform a specific task that is rooted in technology. That's not right.
One benefit that COVID did end up providing
Amen.
Was access for a lot of the community, a lot of the disability community to actually start working for a lot of jobs that were like totally butts in seats. You have to go to an office, sit down in an office, whatever. There was a big market of people that weren't able to like go to offices. And now with COVID being remote friendly, a lot of like it was eye-opening that like people that have disabilities that wouldn't normally be able to go to a traditional whatever office are now able to work and provide value. And
Yeah.
that is something, I don't know if you
Yeah.
all have thoughts on that.
3% of our population was working remotely prior to the pandemic. We have now come to understand at least 50% of the population can work remotely. Back in the day when people with disabilities who usually also have a mobility issue, I can't see where I'm going, so issue. If we were asking for a reasonable accommodation of allowing me to work from home, that wasn't considered reasonable. Now it's the norm.
Really?
Yeah, it wasn't a reasonable accommodation because there was no way they could track your hours. Back in the day, we didn't have the electronic clocks and timers.
Right.
You know, and when you do hire a person with a disability, which is another reason why, just from our socioeconomic perspective, you're going to decrease overhead significantly. You're going to increase brand and image appreciation. You're going to cut down on turnover rates because when that person with the disability gets their job, they're having to probably start a good hour and a half earlier than everybody else just to get into whatever transportation they have to get into to get to work. Once we've mastered that, we're never going to quit. We are the most loyal, appreciative employees you ever have. And legal, and you had that acronym before. Yeah, that. Legal and HR are the biggest barriers to employment for people with disabilities because there's this fear factor that we're going to get sued if they hurt themselves. Newsflash. A person with a disability isn't going to be the one who steps on an 8-foot ladder when it should have been a 12-foot ladder to try and reach for that thing on the shelf. It's going to be the able-bodied person who's an idiot. People with disabilities are not a risk for work. They are a huge contribution and an improvement on bottom lines.
It's almost like that taboo is kind of echoing.
It's antiquated misperceptions.
I love talking about this because your neurodiverse talents at work are going to think of things so creatively in ways that you've never thought of before, because as a daily part of life, they need to think of creative solutions on how to solve problems just because of that.
Right.
Yep.
People with disabilities who have to figure out how to get outside and walk around and figure their way around in a wheelchair.
Or the combination of keystrokes on a computer just to work through a software program.
Exactly. And like these types of conversations, you create a more creative workforce and you create a more robust workforce. And this is the same conversation that we had and we're still having with, women in leadership positions currently. We're talking about creating a diverse talent. I don't think there's anyone going back there. I don't think I hear any CEOs out there saying, man, I wish we were less diverse.
Yeah. But I think Ramona had said it before that most diversity those letters, E&I programs don't include people with disabilities. Absolutely. Part of that has to do again with antiquated perceptions, Frank, of HIPAA law. We can't ask a person if they have a disability, yet the Rehab Act of 1973 has section 503, wherein if any company does work with a federal funded, state funded entity in excess of $15,000, 7% of their workforce must have a disability. How do we achieve that? Unless we openly discuss what our issues are again. And I think he is right, though the number is just mind-blowing that only 25% of the disability population has a obvious physical or apparent disability. Most of us carry dyslexia around or some other mental illness around or some other hidden disability. And it's been a stigma admitting to that.
Well, and that's probably, because of the stigma, it's hidden because people hide it, and you have something to say?
I was just going to say it's something that could be covered, and since we're from a society that implores people to cover because disabilities are taboo, you go ahead and lean into that. I have an invisible disability, so I won't be discriminated against for my disability, and now I won't talk about it, and I don't want people to know because I don't want them to think of me differently. So I think that exactly that.
Yeah.
For sure.
I just wanted to highlight, just from a statistics standpoint, Ken, you were talking about women and women in tech especially, but I was reading, I think it was a NBC article that across all ethnicities, women make up probably 26% of all roles in tech, right? And the power of being seen and being visible, I think, is so important. And one of the things that really touched us when we launched our fellowship program is we had people apply from all over the world, literally. And we created a graphic with sort of a cartoon-like characters that were women, quote unquote, appearing, female gendered, but they were blue people, no sort of ethnic descriptor or appearance. Thank you. And 98% of the applications that we got for our fellowship program were predominantly women and women of color. And my brother and I are actually going to be doing a survey of all the people who participated to really find out what was it about our fellowship program. But a quick little anecdote or story. Yeah, 2 women applying, one from the UK, one from the US. And when we told them they got the fellowship, mind you, this is a non-paid position. We're giving people access to opportunities for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, giving them a title. They get, obviously a letter of recommendation to just experience their job. They cried. And they just were so happy. And they said, thank you for acknowledging us, because we just don't feel seen in this tech environment from a job pursuit perspective. And it was really touching. So I just wanted to say, I think the importance of visibility and being seen, but also as a woman of color and a tech founder, I'm going to probably think about giving certain folks a chance, even if they don't have the experience. I see the intentionality that they're putting forth to gain experience. And so I think in our roles, same for anyone who is living with a particular disability, how can we, I think you tapped into that word, be empathetic, and also think about what are some ways that I can use my privilege, because we all have a privilege in some form or fashion, to make sure that I am giving access to people who maybe don't.
So that's interesting. So I saw in the notes that you're a founder, co-founder of a tech company, but you don't have a background in tech.
No,
How did you fall into that? Was that intentional, accidental?
Yeah,
Or
so
somewhat of both?
I think a little bit of both. So I was an early pioneer back in 2007 to 2011, teaching social media marketing at my alma mater, Marymount University. So many people were not thinking about using social media for business then. And my brother went on his tech journey. He too was a non-technical founder. He's a social scientist, but he had a vision for this idea for WeUp. And in 2018, he asked me if I would take on the CEO role. I have a background in strategic communications and owned an agency for many years and have been a co-founder of other ventures. I'm a serial entrepreneur. And I was a little intimidated because I've always wanted to work in tech. But I think going back to that idea of when you don't see people who look like you, and it wasn't even about not seeing women or people of color, but just not seeing people who aren't techies, right? And I just didn't think that I could fit in. And from a vulnerable moment perspective, I think something that we all have dealt with at some point in our lives is this idea of imposter syndrome, right? Or I don't belong, or I can't work in this particular capacity because I don't have the skill set. And so for me, I think what helped me get over it was realizing, well, what's my job as the CEO? My job is to serve my team and to make sure that I identify the best tech talent to make the best tech product.
Yep.
And making sure that I'm listening to people. And I knew that I could do that. And so for me, I think that's really helped me overcome some of the stigma, I think sometimes that a lot of people face when they're coming into tech as a non-technical person.
I totally get that. I totally get that. It's kind of funny because my blind spot, we guide corporations and governmental agencies on how to create usable, functional digital platforms. I have engineers, I have technology people. The only thing I know about technology is when it doesn't work, don't give me a baseball bat. It will be destroyed. But it's interesting. I sometimes, Ramona, I identify with, am I just faking it with people? But no, I'm an actual voice of people who don't have the technologies working, sitting down across from people from MIT and chief technology officers and telling them their baby is ugly, their emperor has no clothes, and they look at me like, you're blind, you don't know what you're talking about. But we do. And I think that's a very interesting place to be. And you really summed it up for me, Ramona. I got that.
Oh, thank you.
No, thank you. I forgot I got it.
Frank, we have a question from the.
Yes, question,
viewers.
and the question, okay.
The question is, how can someone currently excluded from the labor market due to an invisible disability find their way back to work?
Well, that's a heavy question.
Yeah.
So, so let me repeat that so it's on the official audio. Is that how someone who is excluded from the labor market currently due to invisible disability find their way back to the job market? Anyone want to take that?
Oh, I can from my experience as a person with disability and the shit they told me, but sorry, bad word. Well, depending on how long you've been out of work, you're going to want to, if there are no jobs available for you, try volunteering somewhere in a field of your choice. This is what they wanted me to do with 2 master's degrees in business acumen, and I opted to start my own company. It's not easy getting back into the workforce, but I think starting off at a volunteer level or at an entry level, something that you might not feel meets your personal quest or criteria for a job, but getting started. We were talking about this before, Ken and I, and Zep, about just starting on disability, on accessibility, and not always worrying about getting it 100% perfect, but starting the journey, starting that focus, and starting that conversation with an organization that would allow you to come out from hiding, so to speak, and get back into the social interactions of a daily bump and grind in the workforce might be one way.
Can I add to something as well? I recently had someone on my live show who encourages people with disabilities to go and apply for government contracts. Specifically, there are. I'd have to look it up again. If the person listening would like to look me up on LinkedIn, please find me there. I can guide you or at least point you in the right direction of that. Because there are billions of dollars being put aside for people with disabilities or marginalized communities or people of minorities, and so there is money put aside by the governments at the state level and the federal level to give you money to do things, to do work, to get real skills and real jobs.
And to that point, to drive that home further, there are documents you can provide or fill out, something called a Schedule A letter for government jobs, and I think there's another one for states. But if you get a Schedule A letter and you're comfortable sharing your diagnosis, that will give you another leg up during the interview process, because there are hiring requirements for people with disabilities. So that's another way to take your skill set, maybe take some extra education to round out your experiences, and definitely get a Schedule A letter.
Yeah, and I think to that point, kind of we talked a lot today about how disabilities are viewed as a taboo, and I think one of the shifts, at least in accessibility's standpoint, is to view your disability as a strength, or sometimes people say your disability is your superpower because it's how you've been able to navigate and learn how to excel in the world. So maybe to those points, you could use it as a leg up. There's also, and we kind of touched upon it today too, there's also quite a few organizations out there that do testing of products for people with disabilities. And I think it's super important for people that are testing products around accessibility to have experience with that specific disability.
Oh my gosh, yes. Applause and Fable are 2 companies that are hiring like mad right now. If you have a disability and are looking for work, they will find you work to do in technology testing.
One more, in addition to that, now that we're saying this, my blind spot. Oh, this is such a great, thank you so much, Lauren and Jim. If you want to get into technology and understanding the wheres and whys behind digital accessibility and digital inclusion, you might take a look. We were founding members of an international organization called the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. They offer various certifications, which is a move to make accessibility and what we're all talking about here a true profession, with academic pursuits at universities and everything. But right now we started a certification process that gives you certificates in PDF remediation, in web design, all rooted in authentic inclusion of ability in what you do. And I think, and then there are other organizations and firms like DeQ or Level Access. DeQ, and that's spelled DEQUE, has something called DeQ University that they will give you free training in accessibility testing from a digital perspective if you have a disability, and you can garner the skills and knowledge necessary to get these certifications. And to the gentleman or woman who asked the question about how to get back into it, people who are certified in this industry who are trying to become digital experts on how to make platforms work for people with disabilities are on the rise and in high demand.
Huge.
And then I think another resource are employment development departments, or EDDs. Most cities have them, so that could be another resource. And then fellowships. So there's tons of fellowships, not just obviously what WeUp has done. We're not geniuses in regards to creating such programs, but that's another way of gaining some experience. And there are some apprenticeship and fellowship programs that are paid, especially to support people who are perhaps challenged from a disability perspective.
And to add, I'm sorry, there are so many fantastic things that are just making my brain spark. Glad I didn't ruin it in college with all the drinking and drugs I did. You might want to take a look at I know New York State has this, and I'm assuming most states do, but they have independent living offices. If you go to your independent living office, there's either one at the state level. You can talk to them about your particular diagnosis, your particular circumstances. And I know for people who are blind and certain people within the spectrum of ability, they will provide a quasi-paid internship for a job to hire you, and you'll get on-the-job training, and the state will subsidize your salary. So if you take a look at some of the options that are available, investigate things in your state. Otherwise, write to me, albert@myblindspot.org, and I can try to find a state representative who could help you formulate a plan to go back to work.
Frank,
Yes,
we
how
have
we doing on time?
5 minutes, and I know Ivy wants to ask a
Okay, Ivy has
question.
a question.
This is for the entire panel, please. The subject is participatory democracy and tech accessibility.
Love
Minor example, but it launches a conversation for the whole group that's listening in.
In 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
When I went to vote on Tuesday, I realized that nothing had changed in the ability for those who might have mobility limitations to cast their ballot. When I had a broken foot a few years ago, I had to walk to the end of the gymnasium and all the way back. And then I asked, are there any accommodations? There are all these people with wheelchairs and canes and walkers. Anyway, shortcut. You also mentioned, Albert mentioned, the large number of visually impaired individuals who are not able to access the full panoply of information that's necessary to be active in democracy. And we're at a time when our democracy is being tested, to say the least. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on ways that technology accessibility is impacting participatory democracy, and what are some things that we can all do?
I'm Canadian, maybe I'll sit this one out.
Oh,
No, but I mean, it's probably the same issue, right?
It is.
No, I know, I don't want to be a monopolizer of words, but I'm going to monopolize this one to death. When I first lost my eyesight, the very first election I was afforded the opportunity to vote in was the Obama-McCain election. And they had just gotten these machines for people who have paralysis. There's a sip and blow. There is, for people who are deaf, they have the captioning. You have people who are blind, they have the audio text. I was so excited, and I went through the entire process and I erased it on purpose so I could do it again. I cried. I was so ecstatic that I didn't lose my right to vote. And then every year I go, it's gotten worse and worse and worse.
Really?
It's difficult, and I don't understand why we all have to go in and play with a piece of paper ballot. We have our thumbprint. We have biometrics. There's ways that we could be able to do this from home in the comfort of our living room and vote on a certain day. It's a very important, I am sorry, that's my phone and it's so far away. It's an important topic, and it goes down to understanding technology and how people use technology. Nothing about us without us. We really need to maintain those machines And, they can't be put away and not used for another year. We have to train the poll people, because when I go there, I've already told them what they need to do, and they said they've done it and they didn't do it this year. I was voting in a school board election because, again, going to your point, our democracy is at risk. And if we don't start voting in the local elections, we're going to be screwed times 10. There was not a voting machine for that election that I could use. I freaked out. Then another time for another local election, it was not working. And oddly enough, the person who fixed it was the guy who got me his son-in-law. I dated his wife for a brief while back in high school. And the only way I could date his daughter was if the father made me work on a Republican primary, and I became so engrossed in the value of voting. It is horrendous. It is promising. There are ways to fix this, but again, it's people like us who are going to complain about our situational disability, where you have to walk through a gym, let alone stand there for 2.5 hours waiting for them to fix it because they don't have anybody on site. It's a really tough problem.
I don't really have a solution other than to say I love business development, and it sounds like it's a disruptive technologist opportunity, right? It sounds like it's a huge business opportunity for someone to solve. So that's what I'll say about it. Thank you.
No, that's it's alarming that it's gotten worse for him. Like, that's not the direction we're supposed to be going in. How are we doing on time? Do we have any other questions
I
from?
just think it's really important that all of you are speaking to all of us today and multiplying the force of knowledge and understanding on these issues, because we have to educate public policy leaders.
Yep.
And we have to educate corporate decision makers now and ongoing, right? So thank you so much.
I'm
for
going to
all
say
your-
one more thing to that. Ivy was your name?
Yes.
New York State, as I mentioned before, has appointed its very first chief disability officer, Kimberly Hill. Kimberly Hill and Governor Hochul are focused in on making sure people with disabilities living in New York State have access and barrier-free access to education, employment, and housing, as well as all this, the trappings that go along with that. There's going to be a move happening. So one of the things I've learned from my experience of having things taken away from me since losing my eyesight is be vocal, be demanding, be clear about what the shortcomings are, and be aware they're going to push back because people like us don't normally complain and ask for considerations. So that's really important to be really clear about that, because we're overcoming two stigmas, in my opinion, with disabilities. For thousands of years, people with disabilities have been unworthy of God's love. They've been unworthy of community. They've been put out in the elements. This is written in the Bible. This is written in the Torah, the Quran. And we have fear and guilt managing that assimilation. Fear, we're going to catch it. Fear, it might happen to us. We don't know what to do with that. And guilt because we haven't been able to protect our loved one from being born with it, getting an illness. And once we get past those emotions as a society, we'll be able to collectively embrace people who have a disability out in public the same way we do in our homes.
Right.
Yes.
I'm gonna have to wrap this up.
Okay.
Could we thank you everyone on Zoom for coming? Everyone, thank you. Everyone who's on Zoom, thank you for coming to this event. And the lottery winners who put their names in email and sent it to info@disruptivetechnologists.com. We'll be emailing you your prizes. And now we're gonna turn off Zoom and we're gonna finish our giveaway with Seth. Thank you.